While I'm not 100% certain about this, that's probably not the landing they had planned out. Here's the entire video.
This is speed. And now, ladies and gentlemen, coming from your left, 1,000 feet, G222 over Reparto Sperimentale Volo. In this steep approach on landing, the glide path is 30 degrees. The G222. 50 seconds for touchdown. Touchdown now.
Oh dear.
Well, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there was a small problem there with the undercarriage of G222.
Oh sure, when I do that type of approach, it's called an unstable approach, but when the military does it, it's called a combat landing. Jokes aside, this maneuver is something you should only see from military pilots. They get special training to do this type of landing, and it's designed in high-risk areas where you want to stay high until the very last minute. You as a passenger, when you're arriving to a normal airport, on average, your typical path that the pilots are going to take is 3 degrees. There are some places it might be a little bit more shallow or a little bit more steep, but you might be at 2.75 degrees or 3.25 degrees, but it's very minor in comparison to what you saw in this video. And the reason is because when you're going into a combat area, you as a pilot or a passenger on a plane that's going into a combat zone are going to want to stay as high as possible for as long as possible, and then you're going to want to dive down, because when you're diving down, you're into the base, you're in the parameters of your base, so it's going to be a lot more safe. And if you're flying on a normal glide path coming into a runway, there's a lot of people that will be able to shoot at you or shoot a missile at you or whatever. So that is the reason that these pilots do this special training, is to stay as high and far away from potential risk, people shooting at you, which on a typical airline flight you shouldn't be having. Something that is really important, and I don't know how long this runway is, but this right here gives us a clue. Anytime you see black with white lettering and a number on it, that is giving you a hint to how long the runway is. You will also see this at civilian airports. There's a lot of markings that you probably would be looking out the window and not realize that it actually means something, but that's what it is. Anytime you see that black with white lettering, that's letting you know you have that many thousand feet remaining to the end of the runway. So we're facing the opposite direction that they're landing. So I don't know how far back it goes, but I would guess that this runway is at least 9,000 feet, which is plenty of stopping distance for this aircraft. I can land a 747 pretty easily on 8,000 feet, so 9,000 feet is more than enough. Here's the problem with these pilots. It looks like where they touch down, they're way past the touchdown zone, which is the first third of the runway. And I think that's where the problem started. You've often heard me talk about never landing on the numbers. So the numbers are the very start of the runway. Sometimes people will do that in flight school where you want to land at the very start of the runway. It's really not that advantageous unless you have an extremely short runway. There's no reason to do that, because if you make a miscalculation and you don't land on the numbers and you land 50 or 100 feet early, you land on a bunch of lights or dirt or grass or hit the side of a mountain. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen if you don't make it to the runway. There was recently a case where some airline pilots did that going into Amsterdam. They came in and for some reason I don't think they were planning to land on the numbers, but they were maybe about to land on the numbers and they missed. They ended up taking out a bunch of lights at the very start of the runway and dragged a bunch of lights onto the runway. So the next plane that went to go take off saw all this debris on the runway, and eventually they investigated and found a plane had hit those lights before they landed and rolled out on the runway. And maybe they didn't know. If you're a long ways away from the area, you might just think, oh man, we just made it on the start of the runway, but they didn't. They hit a bunch of lights. So landing on the numbers is not great, and the other side of that is also not great, landing way down towards the end of the runway. Usually what you're aiming to do is land on these markers. We call them the 1,000-foot markers. There's these big, bold, white markers that are on the runway. You're aiming to land on those, but your touchdown zone is the first third of the runway, the first few thousand feet. Depends on the length of the runway, the plane you're on, but roughly the first third of the runway is what you're aiming to land on from those 1,000-foot markers and before you get to the first third of the runway, just to give you an idea. But from what it looks like here in this video, they're landing way down towards the middle part of the runway. And if you notice right here, you can actually see the pilots push the nose of the plane over. Now you'll see that the plane was in landing configuration, and the reason that they do that, they put the gear out and they put the flaps out, isn't only so they're ready to land, but it's also to help slow the plane down, because you're staying really high as long as possible, and then you're going down really fast. So you start going down really fast, the plane obviously picks up speed. If it picks up speed, the wings want to fly. So it's a very gentle balance of going down, not speeding up, so that way you can get down on the runway and land and stop before the end of the runway. But if you come down or you come in too fast for whatever reason, you're going to float, which is kind of what was happening there. And that would be okay if they had landed or planned to land earlier down the runway, but because they were so far down the runway, you saw the pilot start to push the nose over to try to get the plane on the ground. And that's a huge problem. You see here as they're coming down, they actually start floating. Then the pilot pushes the nose, which makes the plane start to porpoise. They go back up in the air again, and that is very dangerous. Watch again as the nose hits first, then the mains, and then they bounce back up in the air again, and that's probably where they should have initiated a go-around. That is a really tricky situation to save, and that pilot actually did a great job saving that. When I was in flight school, I had this type of landing where I hit the nose first and then the mains and bounce back up in the air, and I think most every pilot who's been through flight school has done this. Maybe not as much as I did it, but I did it several times, and my instructor used to tell me, if you get in this situation, just do a go-around. Don't try to save it. You can save it by adding some power and pulling some power, and then you have to redo the landing, which is what they did here, and they actually saved it and stopped and landed. So that pilot did a good job saving it. The problem is that you saw it bounce once off the nose, then a second time on the nose. I don't know where the break that happened on that nose strut, but that is a terrible situation to be in. And so that's why pilots, if they're ever going to land on their nose for whatever reason, they do a go around. And if you ever bounce and you start to see a pilot try to push the nose over, which has happened before, and I've talked about it in other videos, on larger aircraft, it can smash them. Now, the reason I didn't smash into the planes that I was doing it in was because my plane weighed like 1,000 pounds or maybe 2,000 pounds. I don't remember how much those planes weighed. And so it's not a lot of weight smashing in on them, and they're designed to take an extreme amount of beating because they know that's what people are learning to fly on, and new pilots just smash airplanes to bits as we go around. The risk when you're doing it on a small propeller plane like what you're learning on is that porpoise, as you saw, it kind of got worse the second time. It can get really bad if you don't make a decision to do a go around and you get down such a steep angle when you go down and hit the nose that the prop hits the ground. It's called a prop strike. You never want to have that. That's how you get a nickname, and I've talked about you never want to get a nickname in aviation because it's never for something cool. So you see this first one, it hits, they bounce back up in the air, and the second one looks even worse. If they didn't recover, the third one would have been even worse, and they could have snapped the nose right there on the third one, but they saved it. However, I believe this nose gear already had a crack in it, and so when they put the weight of stopping on it, it just collapses. All the momentum of that plane starts to shift forward as you try to really stomp on the brakes. All that weight goes forward and goes onto that nose, so if there's any fracture or anything on that nose, it's just not going to be able to hold. The nose is not designed to take any impact like that. That's why they always teach you to fly the nose of the plane onto the ground. If you were to do something like that, you have the risk of the nose collapsing, exactly like you saw there. I suspect what happened here is the pilots started their dive too late. By starting their dive too late, the pilots were already a long ways down the runway when they rolled out from their dive to try to get onto the runway. There have been times in my life as a pilot where I have made a landing work even though I shouldn't have done it. And I don't know what it is about the mentality of a pilot is they'll see a situation and they'll think, I can save this, watch this. So there have been times where I have done that and I thought, I got this, and I landed and it was fine, even though afterwards you'll talk to the other pilot and you think, maybe we should have done a go around. I don't know why it is that pilots will sometimes try to save it, which is what you saw here. They tried to save it, but it was too far gone. They were going to be going and landing too far down the runway, and if he had done everything perfectly, rolled out perfectly, not floated, or had just not pushed the nose over as hard as they did, and just got those mains on, they could have braked and stopped in time. The problem is that by pushing the nose over, they collapse that nose gear. You really have to gain some experience of knowing when you can save something, when you just need to let it go. And fortunately, that just takes experience. Until you see enough different situations, then you'll know, hey, that's a savable one, that's not savable, we need to go around and do it again. I'm guessing because they're at an air show, they're trying to demonstrate their skills, they're thinking, yes, we can save it. And it was, I think, savable if they had just not pushed the nose over. You see here, if they had just taken this float and just waited another second or two, the mains would have came down and touched. Unfortunately, what happens in that situation, and that has happened to me as well, even on the 747, one of the first landings that I did after I got off of training, it was windy, I kept the power in maybe a little bit too much, and we started to float down the runway. And the captain said, better get this on the ground. Now, I knew better than to nose it over and push the nose on there, but you're up there, you're floating, and what's the only thing you can do? You have the power all the way out, you're just floating, and you're just chewing up runway really fast. Now, obviously you think, get the nose down, and what you can kind of do is jerk the plane's nose a little bit, just to kind of get it to slide down a little bit. That's really the only thing you can do. If the power's already out, you're just gonna have to wait it out. Had they just waited it out, they would have been fine. So this is obviously fuel that's coming out the wing there, and the fuel systems on aircraft can get relatively complicated, but this is a pretty simple one to explain. I'm pretty sure this is what it is. Here's a picture that I found online of the 727 fuel system, and you can see here on the wingtips, that is where the fuel is coming out during this video. I never flew the 727, and to be honest with you, I'm too lazy to go research the entire fuel system to be 100% certain about this, but here's the thing that you need to know about fuel systems for aircraft. They need to have a positive and a negative pressure. And the reason is think about like when you're drinking out of a water bottle. If you just keep drinking and drinking out of that water bottle and don't let air get into that water bottle, what happens? It ends up collapsing in on you, right? And then on the other side of that, if you are putting like a soda can in the freezer and let it freeze, the temperature is going to create, in that case, the soda to expand. If it expands, it needs to have somewhere to go, but there's nowhere to go because it's a closed off can, and then that thing deforms. Your soda deforms inside that can, right? So it needs to have a place to let air get in and let air get out. And otherwise, you're going to have a wing that's going to get crumpled and deformed. And that obviously would be a problem because the fuel tank's being in the wing. You now have a crumpled or deformed wing, and you don't want that. Now, a friend of mine whose dad was a Pan Am 747 pilot way back in the day used to tell me that what they used to do when they would fill the 747 is they would hook it up, and they'd put these containers below where you saw that fuel coming out on the 727. They'd put some containers there, and they would just keep pumping fuel until the fuel came out there, and that's how they knew that the plane was topped off, because the gauges were not nearly as accurate as ours are now. Fuel was cheap. They didn't care about carrying extra gas, so that was how they knew they were topped off. They just dump into those containers, and then they were like, great, we're full, now we can go, which to me is wild, but you know, back in the day, why not? The person who sent this to me, they asked, why is the fuel coming out of one wing and not the other? Since the plane is turning to the right and possibly turning twice to the right, I can't see the turn right before that, the fuel is going to be spilling into that left wing vent surge tank, and then when it keeps spinning, that surge tank is just going to let everything in there go. I'm not 100% sure, but my guess is once it hits that surge tank, it is going to be going out and not coming back or being used again. Now, you as a pilot, if you're taking the runway, are not going to know about that back there. My guess is those pilots had no idea that that was even going on. And once they got up in the air, someone maybe have told them or reported it, but it doesn't really matter. They would have understood the fuel systems a lot better than I do to know that it would have been something that would leaked into the surge tank and blew out. They would have checked their fuel while they were flying to make sure everything was balanced. And that little bit of fuel is not really going to be a major impact when you're doing a long flight. If you're going for a few hours, that couple gallons of gas that's spilled out isn't going to be a big deal. Now, that fuel that we have on aircraft like this is mostly kerosene. A lot of that is going to dissipate before it even hits the ground. It's very different from the fuel you will put in your car. So while you do see a lot going in there, you'll notice when it's taking off, it's kind of just dissipating a lot quicker than you might see from normal gasoline that you put in your car. And that's because the fuel that we put in jet engines is a lot closer to kerosene. So it's not likely to create the same impact of, let's say, a regular gas. As you're spraying gas all over the place, this is going to dissipate a lot quicker, and that's why when we dump fuel in an emergency situation, it's not just raining gasoline all over the houses below, because it just breaks apart before it ever gets there. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one over here. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.